Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into the story of the spy who brought down a chancellor, not with bombs, not with guns, but with trust. Günter Guillaume walked unnoticed into the heart of West German power, whispered in meetings, smiled at Brandt, and reported everything to East Berlin. For years, no one suspected a thing, until one knock at the door changed everything. Before we get started, hit like and subscribe if you're here for shocking history that reads like a thriller. Drop a comment. Tell me where you're watching from and what you'd do if someone in your government was secretly spying on you. Now, lean in and let yourself feel the tension. Tonight, we go behind closed doors in 1974 Bonn and step into the quiet, deadly life of Günter Guillaume, the man who toppled a chancellor without firing a shot. In the pale light of early morning, the street was still, Bonn wrapped in a silence that felt more deliberate than natural. A convoy of unmarked cars rolled up quietly, engines low, tires crunching over damp cobblestones. The residents of this quiet district, a neighborhood of manicured hedges and discreet government apartments, still slept soundly, unaware that one of the most dramatic acts of Cold War espionage was about to unfold right before their doors. Inside the first car, plainclothes officers checked their watches in near unison, their breaths shallow with anticipation. They were men accustomed to secrecy, men who had rehearsed this operation in their minds dozens of times. They stepped out, moving swiftly, their shoes tapping in rhythm like an unspoken code. One man raised his fist, halt, then nodded. The lead agent ascended the short staircase to the apartment, pausing only to adjust his coat. He knocked once, then twice, the sound echoing far louder in the morning stillness than anyone expected. Seconds passed. The door opened. Standing there was a man in his robe, his hair slightly disheveled, eyes blinking from sleep. He was not startled, not panicked. Instead, he gave the faintest trace of a smile, as though the game had finally reached its final move and he alone knew it all along. Günter Guillaume. To the world, he was nothing more than a civil servant, a diligent aide in the chancellor's office, the kind of man who blended into the background. But to the East German intelligence service, he was a prized asset, a man who had walked undetected through the very corridors of power in West Germany. The agent spoke quickly, firmly, his German clipped. "You are under arrest on suspicion of espionage." The smile flickered, but Guillaume did not resist. His eyes, however, carried the weight of something more. Not fear, not guilt, but the strange calm of a man who had already accepted his fate. He knew the moment would come, just not when. Freeze this image. The unassuming man in the doorway, the dawn that bore witness to his fall. This was no ordinary bureaucrat. This was the spy who toppled a chancellor. But how did a quiet man from Berlin slip into the heart of West German democracy? How could someone who fetched coffee, arranged meetings, and drafted letters for Willy Brandt, one of Europe's most respected leaders, betray him so completely? And how could no one see him coming? To answer that question, the story must be rewound, back to the beginning, to a boy born in the ruins of a country on fire. Berlin, 1937. A city already trembling under the weight of flags and parades, its air heavy with speeches and the promise of glory. It was here that Günter Guillaume entered the world, the son of ordinary parents in extraordinary times. His father, a tailor's assistant, stitched fabric for uniforms he barely understood. His mother, a woman hardened by poverty, believed discipline was the only shield against chaos. In their small apartment, the air always seemed to vibrate with unease. Radios blaring Hitler's speeches, neighbors whispering of arrests, boots echoing in the stairwell at night. By the time Günter was old enough to understand the world around him, Germany was already marching towards destruction. He remembered the blackouts first, curtains pulled tight, the eerie hush as bombers droned above, the sudden eruption of sirens. He remembered the nights spent in basements with dozens of neighbors crammed into the dark, the smell of fear and damp concrete mixing in his lungs. He remembered hunger, the gnawing emptiness of days when food was rationed to crumbs, when his mother's eyes grew hollow, but her hands remained firm. For a boy, war was both terror and adventure. The craters on the street were places to explore. The rubble of collapsed buildings became playgrounds. But even as he played, Günter absorbed something else: the fragility of order, the speed with which authority could vanish. One day, there were parades. The next, there were ruins. One day, neighbors saluted each other. The next, they were gone, taken or dead. As he grew older, he saw his city torn apart piece by piece. Berlin was no longer the capital of triumph, but of survival. By 1945, when the Red Army thundered in, he was 8 years old. The city was a carcass. Women lined up for bread that never came, soldiers stumbled drunkenly through the streets, and children scavenged for coal. Günter's world had no stability, no certainty. It was in this chaos that he began to yearn for something else: order, structure, a system that would not collapse in a week. For some, the answer was the West: democracy, freedom, the lure of America. For others, it was the East: discipline, loyalty, the promise of equality. For Günter, it was not so much an ideological choice as a psychological need. He wanted something that would not break under pressure. In the years after the war, Berlin was divided, first informally, then brutally. The East was governed by Soviet-backed authorities, their rhetoric sharp and unforgiving. It was there that young men like Günter were noticed. He was dutiful, organized, and most of all, eager to belong. While others drifted into crime or despair, he found meaning in meetings, in slogans, in the rigid discipline of the new socialist order. He joined the Free German Youth, then the Socialist Unity Party, attending rallies where voices thundered about rebuilding a nation from the ashes. The words spoke to him. Unlike the chaos of his childhood, this was certainty, rules, loyalty, no questions. But in the shadows of East Berlin, another organization watched him closely: the Ministry for State Security, the Stasi. They were always searching for men like him, disciplined, obedient, quietly ambitious, men who could be molded. The first approach was subtle. A man, older, with cold eyes and an unremarkable suit, lingered after a party meeting. He complimented Günter on his speech, asked questions about his family, his ambitions. The man spoke softly, never revealing much, but his presence carried authority. Their conversations grew more frequent: coffee at a cafe, a walk through the park, discussions about loyalty, about service, about Germany's future. One evening in a room thick with cigarette smoke, the man leaned closer. "You say you love your country. Would you serve it in a different way?" Günter hesitated. His heart raced, though he tried to keep his face calm. He understood the meaning, though it was never said outright. This was no invitation to party work. This was something deeper, darker, more dangerous. He looked down at his hands, then back up. He nodded. From that moment, the path was set. He was no longer just another party loyalist. He was a candidate for something greater: a life of shadows, of secrets, of duality. But the man was not finished. He leaned even closer, his words deliberate, heavy with implication. "Your mission will not be here, not in East Berlin, not among comrades. It will be across the wall, among enemies." The silence that followed was thicker than smoke. For a moment, Günter felt both fear and exhilaration. He was being asked to abandon the familiar, to step into a world of lies, of disguises, of perpetual danger. But he also felt the pull of destiny. To serve in the heart of the enemy was not a burden. It was an honor. He swallowed, nodded again, and sealed his fate. The boy who had grown up in the ruins of Berlin, who had craved order and certainty, had just agreed to become the perfect infiltrator. And so, the story of the spy who would one day topple a chancellor truly began. The night air was thick with unease, as though the city itself knew what was about to happen. It was August 1961, and Berlin had become a powder keg waiting for the match. Families whispered rumors of troop movements. Neighbors stared at strange construction trucks that rolled into the city at midnight, and the streets seemed quieter than they should have been, like the silence that precedes a thunderstorm. No one quite knew what the Soviets and their East German allies were planning, but they sensed it. In the small apartment of Günter and Christel Guillaume, there was no confusion, no speculation, only readiness. They already knew. This was not a rumor for them, not an uncertain future. This was the beginning of their assignment. While other Berliners wondered whether their lives were about to be cut in half by stone and wire, Günter already had his orders. The wall would rise, and with it his opportunity to vanish into the west. The orders had come with chilling precision, delivered in the calm monotone of his Stasi handler, as though he were describing nothing more remarkable than a train timetable. The handler had explained that the open wound of Berlin had to be closed, that East Germany could not afford to keep bleeding citizens into the west. The wall would solve that problem, but it would also provide a smokescreen. In the chaos of people scrambling to escape before the city was sealed, certain individuals could slip through, and one of them would be Günter Guillaume. Unlike those who ran with desperation, he would walk with purpose. His defection would be carefully staged, every detail rehearsed, his loyalty buried beneath a mask of disillusionment. When the wall began to rise, in the early hours of August the 13th, 1961, ordinary East Berliners woke to the nightmare of barbed wire fencing and armed guards splitting the city overnight. Some tried to run across before it hardened into concrete, leaping over wire, dodging gunfire, dragging children by the hand. The streets shook with the sound of hammering and shouted orders. Families wept as they realized they were cut off from loved ones on the other side. For Günter and Christel, the sight of barbed wire being unfurled was not a prison closing in, but the stage curtain rising on their performance. They packed their bags methodically, making sure to look as though they were carrying no more than frightened refugees might take. A few clothes, photographs, modest keepsakes. They left behind items deliberately to make it believable. They whispered loud enough for neighbors to hear, rehearsed lines of complaint about the East German regime, and even staged small quarrels about whether leaving was worth the risk. Every moment was theater. Every step was scripted. Crossing the border was its own performance of fear. Christel clutched her handbag like a lifeline, her hands trembling just enough to look authentic. Günter's face was set in a mask of anxious determination, his eyes darting left and right, the way a man might look if he were expecting a bullet in the back. They joined the stream of frightened Berliners pressing toward the checkpoints, each step weighted with tension. Around them, real fear swirled, the frantic breaths of people who truly had no idea if they would make it across. Guards barked orders, their rifles gleaming under the harsh lights. The smell of sweat and fear hung in the air. For most of those crossing, it was a matter of survival. For the Guillaume, it was an audition. If the guards doubted their story, if they noticed even the faintest glimmer of calculation in Günter's eyes, the operation was over before it began. Günter handed over their papers with trembling hands, his voice cracking as he stammered about wanting a better life in the West. The guard looked at him, then at Christel, then at the small boy they had brought with them. Suspicion flickered across the man's eyes. The pause stretched, seconds dragging like hours. Then the papers were stamped. The barrier lifted. They were waved through. The Guillaume did not run, though every instinct screamed at them to. Running would betray them. Instead, they walked with the measured pace of people too stunned to believe they had succeeded. Once across, Christel allowed her knees to buckle, collapsing into tears that looked spontaneous, but were as rehearsed as every line of dialogue in a play. Neighbors would later remember it vividly, the young couple who cried with relief at finally escaping the prison of the East. Nobody knew that behind those tears was the calm satisfaction of professionals who had just slipped into their roles. Frankfurt was their new stage, a city buzzing with commerce, democracy, and political ambition. It was also a city that welcomed defectors with open arms. The Guillaume became just another family who had escaped from tyranny, and for West Germans that was enough. In the early days, they lived modestly, taking small jobs, mingling in cafes, making friends with neighbors who pitied their supposed hardship. Günter would sit in smoky taverns, nursing a beer and listening to men talk about politics, occasionally offering a remark about the failures of East German socialism. He knew just how to sound, critical enough of the East to seem authentic, but not so outspoken as to appear like a zealot seeking approval. He built his legend brick by brick, not with bold declarations, but with casual credibility. The legend was the spy's armor. Günter was no longer simply a courier for East German intelligence. He was a refugee rebuilding his life, a loyal West German citizen, a man grateful for the freedoms of the Federal Republic. He joined civic groups, volunteered for political meetings, and always kept just enough distance from suspicion. Christel, too, played her part. She became the friendly neighbor, the woman who offered coffee and cake, who listened sympathetically to friends' complaints, who talked about the struggles of adjusting to a new life. In their small apartment, the laughter of their child added a sheen of innocence to the household. Every smile, every gesture, every conversation was an investment in their cover. But the legend was more than surface-level theater. It required roots. To spy successfully, you did not simply pass yourself off as someone else. You became that person in the eyes of those around you. Günter began attending meetings of the Social Democratic Party, then the largest opposition party in West Germany. He took notes, shook hands, asked questions that seemed earnest but were designed to map the personalities and rivalries within. To others, he looked like an eager political volunteer, hungry to participate in democracy. To the Stasi, he was a seed sprouting exactly where they had planted him. Suspense often came in the quietest moments. A neighbor dropping by unexpectedly when a coded letter was on the table. A postal worker handing Christel a package and lingering a moment too long as though curious. Each interaction was a test. Each smile, each laugh had to conceal the steady thrum of paranoia underneath. The Guillaumes lived as if on stage at all hours, aware that even a slip in private could ripple outward. In the evenings, when they shut the curtains and whispered in low tones, they allowed themselves brief moments of honesty. But even then, the walls felt like they had ears. Günter sometimes dreamed of his handler's monotone voice, reminding him that there was no room for error. The techniques they used to communicate were deceptively simple. Their first packet of intelligence was nothing more than a letter. Inside, the words were bland, a personal note to a distant relative. But embedded within the lines were codes that only trained eyes could recognize. The letter traveled unnoticed, carried across the border as though it contained nothing more sinister than greetings and family news. On the other side, a Stasi officer unfolded it, read between the lines, and smiled. The machine was running. Each successful transmission emboldened Günter. Each handshake at a political gathering, each casual chat with a local official, each note scribbled in the margins of his notebook became fuel for the system he served. His life in Frankfurt was not a disguise he would wear for a day or a week. It was a second skin he would live in for years. And yet, the danger never lessened. One careless word, one inconsistent detail, one suspicious neighbor could unravel it all. As 1964 drew to a close, the Guillaumes had become fixtures in their community. They were known as friendly, reliable, ordinary. Nobody looked twice when Günter walked into a social democratic meeting. Nobody questioned Christel's cheerful chatter in the market. They had become invisible in the most dangerous way possible, by appearing completely normal. And then came the moment that confirmed their work was not only unnoticed, but effective. A letter slipped through the postal system, harmless on the surface, yet brimming with carefully concealed data about the pulse of West German politics. The Stasi received it, logged it, and filed it under Guillaume's growing dossier. It was the first real proof that their mole was alive and feeding. The curtain had risen, the play had begun, and the audience, all of West Germany, didn't even know they were watching. The Guillaumes were no longer simply defectors. They were operatives deep inside enemy territory, their lives a constant balancing act between banality and betrayal. And as they settled into their roles, the stakes only grew higher, because the small packets of intelligence they sent across were not ends in themselves, but preludes to something larger. The Stasi's plan was unfolding with patience, and Günter Guillaume was now firmly planted in the soil of the West, a seed that would grow roots so deep that one day he would stand beside the very men who shaped West Germany's destiny. And yet, even as he sent that first packet, his heart quickened with the knowledge that it was only the beginning. The legend was intact, the cover was working, and the system was listening. The silence of an ordinary Frankfurt night was broken only by the scratching of his pen, the faint whisper of ink that could topple governments. The world around him saw only a refugee who had found a home, but in the shadows a machine had begun to hum, and it would not stop until history itself was shaken. The packet had crossed the border unnoticed, a quiet victory wrapped in invisible ink, and Günter Guillaume returned to his ordinary routine with the calm of a man who had just thrown a stone into a lake, knowing the ripples would travel outward for years. His days remained those of a civic-minded immigrant, handshakes at community halls, his name penciled onto volunteer lists, evenings spent drafting minutes for meetings that no one else wanted to write. But as 1964 bled into 1965, the Stasi's man in West Germany was no longer simply a shadow in the suburbs. He was positioning himself within the bloodstream of politics, and he was doing it with the patience of a chameleon that changes its colors so slowly that no one notices until it has already blended into the branch. The Social Democratic Party was not glamorous in its local form. It was tedious, often dull work, endless stacks of newsletters to fold, letters to type, schedules to arrange, rooms to book for meetings that no one would thank him for organizing. But it was here, in this gray bureaucratic grind, that Guillaume excelled. While others grew bored, he thrived on precision, on being the man who could be relied upon to finish the task no one else had the energy for. It was his shield as much as his weapon. Each sheet of paper he filed, each note he took, each quiet nod of agreement was another stitch in the fabric of belonging. He was becoming indispensable precisely because he appeared so unremarkable. His handlers in East Berlin fed him caution with every transmission. "You are not a comet," one Stasi officer told him in a carefully coded message. "You are a shadow. Stay boring. Stay useful. A shadow that shines gets burned." Yet Guillaume's problem was that he was too good at being useful. Local party officials noticed that, while others argued endlessly about resolutions or wasted evenings in debate, Guillaume always delivered. He organized fundraisers, arranged travel schedules, took meticulous minutes. If an event ran smoothly, his fingerprints were on it, though he never tried to make it obvious. He was rewarded not with glory, but with responsibility, which suited him perfectly, because responsibility brought proximity, and proximity brought access. At home, the contradiction grew heavier. His young son needed help with homework, and Guillaume played the role of devoted father with earnestness that even his Stasi reports couldn't fully capture. He would sit at the small kitchen table, guiding the boy through arithmetic, listening patiently to stories from school, nodding as his wife, Crystal, described the latest neighborhood gossip. And yet, when the lights dimmed and the house settled into sleep, he moved quietly to his small desk. There, with a lamp shielded to avoid suspicion, he transformed from father into operative. Pages of meeting notes became intelligence reports, margins filled with symbols only the Stasi could read. Sometimes his pen scratched over paper until dawn, his body betraying fatigue, but his mind refusing rest, for he knew that in the strange duality of his life, both worlds had to remain intact. One slip, one overlap, and everything would collapse. He learned the art of silence in rooms filled with noise. The SPD gatherings were crowded, smoky affairs, where egos collided and whispered alliances determined the future of local branches. Men in rumpled suits smoked too much and drank cheap wine while trading accusations and promises. Guillaume entered these spaces like a man taking the measure of a stage, never stealing the spotlight yet always listening. He nodded at the right times, laughed when expected, and kept his opinions measured, neutral enough to avoid offense, but pointed enough to mark him as competent. And as his eyes scanned the shifting alliances, he memorized faces, mapped rivalries, and later, in the privacy of his desk, reconstructed entire evenings for East Berlin. He could describe who argued with whom, who lingered too long at the bar, who whispered in corners, and most importantly, who might rise and who might fall. Every month his reports thickened. His handlers, cautious at first, began to sense the depth of what he was building. This was not gossip. It was raw intelligence on the inner gears of West Germany's political machine. But even as they encouraged him, they warned him again. "Be careful," another message whispered. "Competence creates eyes. Too many eyes, and your shadow fades." Guillaume acknowledged the danger, but he could not restrain the quiet satisfaction of being needed. He had long ago committed himself to the cause, but here was something more personal, recognition, even if it came cloaked in the mundane rituals of party work. The paradox of his life pressed down on him in subtler ways. Crystal sometimes caught his distant stare at the dinner table. "You're somewhere else again," she teased gently, though there was always a trace of unease beneath her smile. He would shake his head, smile back, and return to whatever story his son was telling. Yet the truth was unavoidable. He was always in two places at once. His mind, split between fatherhood and espionage, between the safety of a suburban family and the invisible chains that tied him to East Berlin, never rested fully in either world. The Stasi knew this pressure could erode even the most disciplined man, but they also knew Guillaume's strength lay in his ability to compartmentalize. He had convinced himself that these compartments could never break. The first true test came when he was invited to a larger regional SPD meeting, one of those crowded, chaotic gatherings where local officials mingled with rising figures from Bonn. For Guillaume, it was both a professional opportunity and a moment of risk. Entering the room, he felt the weight of eyes brushing past him, none lingering long enough to suspect, but each one capable of noticing too much if he erred. The air was thick with cigarette smoke, voices overlapping in a cacophony of ambition. Men jostled for attention, women balanced notebooks and cigarettes, and the conversation shifted from policy to gossip to whispered deals with dizzying speed. Guillaume stood at the periphery, smile measured, movements calculated. He shook hands, introduced himself with practiced humility, offered assistance when others fumbled with papers or logistics. His pen scribbled notes, but his mind was recording much more. Who commanded respect? Who deferred? Who lingered in conversation with whom? Later that night, his report would transform this swirling chaos into a map of influence that the Stasi analyst would read with keen interest. For now, he remained the quiet observer, absorbing everything. And yet, in the middle of that crowded hall, as voices rose and smoke curled toward the ceiling, something unexpected happened. A presence entered the room, commanding attention without demanding it. Willy Brandt, charismatic, magnetic, the rising star of the SPD, moved through the crowd with the ease of a man who belonged at the center. Conversations shifted as he passed, laughter brightened, even the air seemed to clear around him. Guillaume felt it instantly, the gravitational pull of a man destined for higher things. He watched carefully, noting not just Brandt's words, but the effect he had on others. For the first time, Guillaume sensed that his shadow was drifting closer to a light, so strong it could both illuminate and expose him. Brandt's eyes swept across the room, pausing briefly on the quiet man, with the neat notes and the unassuming presence. For a moment, Guillaume felt the weight of that gaze, as though the future chancellor had noticed something useful, or perhaps simply reliable. Later that evening, an introduction was made, casual but deliberate. Guillaume's handshake was firm, his smile modest. Brandt nodded, then moved on. To others, it was nothing, a forgettable moment in a forgettable evening. But Guillaume understood. In politics, first glances could become pathways, and this was the beginning of a path that would draw him inexorably closer to the very heart of West German power. As the meeting dissolved into smaller circles and the night wore on, Guillaume kept his composure. He knew better than to appear overeager. But inside, a tremor of both fear and exhilaration passed through him. The Stasi's shadow had been seen, not for what he was, but for what he could be, useful. That was the most dangerous recognition of all. And so, he left the smoky hall with his notes tucked neatly under his arm, his face calm, his steps steady. But in his mind, the words of his handlers echoed with new intensity. Stay boring, stay useful, stay in the shadows. Yet, the shadows were narrowing, and ahead of him loomed a man whose charisma lit entire rooms. Guillaume's path had crossed with Willy Brandt's, and the slow burn of espionage had just been set alight with the spark of destiny. Would Brandt remember the quiet chameleon who had organized the unglamorous details? Would the future chancellor see him as just another functionary, or as something more? Guillaume did not know yet, but he sensed that the game he had been playing in whispers and coded messages was about to accelerate into something far more dangerous. The man who had promised to remain invisible had just been noticed, and from this moment on, the stakes would only climb higher. Imagine a locked room in Bonn, thick curtains drawn against the early autumn light of 1969, the scent of tobacco lingering in the air as the newly sworn chancellor leans over his desk, signing the documents that would shape the future of West Germany. His signature flowed with the weight of history, foreign policy decisions, NATO agreements, sensitive correspondence meant for only the tightest of circles. And just a few steps away, almost invisible in his quiet efficiency, sat Günter Guillaume, the loyal aide who carried files from cabinet to chancellor, who answered the late-night calls when the chancellor was too tired to lift the receiver himself, who knew the rhythm of Brandt's days and nights better than almost anyone else in government. No one saw the shadow he carried. No one suspected that the man trusted to carry sealed envelopes was silently cataloging every decision for the other Germany. And as Brandt's pen scrawled across paper, Guillaume's mind was already calculating the moment he would duplicate those words under the dim light of his own study, turning West German state secrets into gifts wrapped for East Berlin. The transition from party politics to the chancellor's office was a natural flow for Guillaume, and that was the genius of his placement. He had never been too ambitious in ways that might arouse suspicion, never too visible to seem like a threat. He had been patient, a man of small gestures and reliable loyalty. Brandt, the eternal skeptic of human motives, saw in him someone modest enough to be trusted, dependable enough to bear the weight of scheduling the chancellor's most private meetings, discreet enough to handle correspondence with world leaders. And Guillaume leaned into that role with a precision that made him indispensable. Each small detail of Brandt's daily life flowed through his hands, the notes before cabinet sessions, the reminders of personal obligations, the carefully arranged balance of diplomacy and rest that a leader constantly under siege required. Yet every note passed through Guillaume's fingers was also weighed for its intelligence value, and each day his work drew him closer not only to Brandt, but to the abyss of betrayal that loyalty demanded. The spycraft of these years was not the glamorous high-speed chase of popular imagination. It was the quiet art of invisibility. Guillaume mastered it as though he had been born to walk unnoticed between two worlds. Sensitive documents were not stolen in dramatic break-ins. They were photocopied late at night, sometimes in his modest apartment where Crystal, his wife, would help prepare the tiny reproductions, aware enough to know what they were doing, but shielded from the full darkness of it by Guillaume's insistence that it was all part of their duty. Those documents would then be reduced again, shrunk into microdots the size of a pinhead, hidden in the loops of harmless-looking letters, holiday greetings, party invitations, notes of thanks that could travel without suspicion across the border. Other times, the ritual of passing secrets required what intelligence officers called wetting. It meant bumping into his handlers in public places in ways that appeared accidental. A brief meeting in a cafe where he might leave behind a folded newspaper stuffed with notes. A casual nod exchanged in a crowded restaurant before one man walked out, leaving a matchbox in the restroom that the other would retrieve. Bond's parks and riverside paths became the settings for these carefully staged acts of espionage. A package left under a park bench, a signal placed with a newspaper folded at a specific angle, the tiniest gestures loaded with meaning. And all the while, the man facilitating these rituals was the same one who sat beside the Chancellor in cabinet rooms, translating his instructions into the language of state. What made it all the more dangerous was the depth of admiration Guillaume genuinely felt for Brandt. Unlike other targets who might be manipulated purely through ego or weakness, Guillaume respected the man he served. He admired Brandt's courage in reaching out to the East, his willingness to challenge entrenched fears, his instinct for reconciliation in a divided world. Each time he watched Brandt speak with passion about Germany's future, Guillaume felt the pull of conflicting loyalties tighten. He was no mere mercenary collecting secrets for pay. His was a faith rooted in ideology, a belief that the socialist experiment across the border required his devotion. And yet, as he carried Brandt's notes from one desk to another, he could not suppress the growing sense that he was betraying not just a nation, but a man who trusted him in ways no one else did. There were nights when Brandt would remain in his office long past midnight, weary from the constant pressure of governing a fragile coalition. Guillaume, ever present, would be the one to pour a glass of water, to remind the Chancellor of a missed meal, to gently suggest a moment of rest. And in those fleeting human exchanges, trust deepened. Brandt confided in him in ways small but telling, his frustrations with party rivals, his impatience with bureaucratic inertia, the loneliness that came with leadership. Each admission was a shard of intimacy that cut deeper into Guillaume's conscience, yet also strengthened his cover. For who would ever suspect betrayal from the man who listened so quietly, who responded so loyally, who seemed almost protective of the Chancellor's well-being? Meanwhile, the flow of intelligence to East Berlin reached heights that astonished his handlers. Internal cabinet debates, NATO documents, early drafts of Brandt's historic Ostpolitik initiatives, all of it filtered through Guillaume's hands. The East German intelligence service, the Stasi, could scarcely believe their fortune. They had an ear not just near the Chancellor's office, but within it, someone who witnessed decisions before they were public, who read communications before they reached other ministers. Their files filled with reports marked with Guillaume's code name, each dispatch a window into the inner workings of West German power. His reports shaped strategy in East Berlin, giving them confidence and insight that made Brandt's bold initiatives less surprising, easier to counter or exploit. The danger grew with each passing month, because the deeper Guillaume embedded himself, the more he risked exposure through a careless moment or a suspicious glance. Yet, he thrived in the routine, his nerves masked by his unremarkable presence. He had learned to be invisible, and in politics invisibility was the ultimate armor. Rivals of Brandt might have sneered at Guillaume's quiet diligence, but none saw reason to question it. He was useful, predictable, without ambition of his own, and it was precisely that absence of ambition that made him so dangerous, because ambition draws attention, but humility slips under the radar. But in espionage, every act carries its own weight of suspense. Each walk in the park to leave a package, each letter with a hidden microdot, each casual meeting with a handler, every one of them could have been the last. Any wrong glance, any misplaced note, any casual betrayal from someone who thought him too eager or too quiet could have shattered the illusion. And in that constant tension lay the true essence of the spy's life, a heartbeat forever a fraction faster, a mind always rehearsing explanations for questions not yet asked. By 1972, Brandt's trust in him had reached such a level that Guillaume sat beside the Chancellor at critical NATO briefings. In rooms thick with military jargon and strategic maps, where generals debated the balance of nuclear weapons and foreign ministers whispered of détente and deterrence, there sat the quiet aide from the SPD offices, now the Chancellor's confidant, quietly absorbing secrets meant to safeguard the West. The East no longer had to wonder what NATO planned. They had someone present, listening, noting, remembering. And in those rooms, Guillaume's heart beat with a dual rhythm. On the one hand, awe at the power and privilege of sitting so close to the heart of Western strategy. On the other, the chilling knowledge that each word he heard was another nail in the coffin of Brandt's trust, another gift to a regime that viewed him only as an instrument. The tension in those rooms was not just geopolitical, it was deeply personal. For he knew, more than anyone else, how fragile trust could be, and how devastating its collapse would become when the truth finally emerged. The stage was set, the lines of loyalty drawn, the betrayals sharpened like knives, waiting in the dark. As Guillaume leaned forward to take notes at a NATO briefing, surrounded by the guardians of Western power, the greatest secret of all hung silently in the air. East Germany now had an unseen ear at the Chancellor's very side, and with each heartbeat, the cost of that secret drew closer, not just for Guillaume, but for Brandt, for Germany, and for the future of the divided world. Imagine walking down a quiet Bond street in the chill of an autumn evening, the air damp with drizzle, when suddenly a car engine hums to life behind you. It does not overtake, it does not honk, it simply follows. The headlights remain unlit, the sound just low enough to make you question whether it is truly there, or if your own fears have conjured it. You try to walk faster, the pavement glistening under the sparse street lamps, your breath quickening with each step, but the soft rumble persists, steady, unyielding, crawling into your mind like a whisper you cannot silence. This was the sensation that began to take root in Günter Guillaume's life in 1972, the subtle but suffocating awareness that something in the shadows had shifted, that the mask he had worn so seamlessly might, at last, be slipping. He had risen from Brandt's aid to something more like a confidant, his proximity to power now almost unrivaled. Yet, even as the Chancellor leaned on him for stability in a storm of scandals, a different storm was gathering, this one invisible, made of surveillance reports, intercepted whispers, and men in dark coats who no longer trusted the quiet figure seated near the heart of West Germany's government. By then, the Federal Intelligence Service, the BND, and their American counterparts in the CIA had begun to notice inconsistencies that no longer seemed like quirks of personality, but markers of something deeper. Guillaume's life, when examined under the growing suspicion of counterintelligence, did not fully add up. His financial situation was peculiar, not extravagant enough to draw immediate alarm, but touched by little comforts that did not align with a man of his modest official salary. A slightly better suit here, a dinner at a restaurant. A civil servant's paycheck should not so easily cover the faint scent of someone greased by resources beyond his pay grade. More troubling still was the near perfection of his past. His story of rising through the Social Democratic Party had no loose ends, no missteps, no shadows of uncertainty. It was, to trained eyes, too clean, too precise, the kind of backstory crafted by someone careful enough to anticipate the gaze of investigators. For years this had been his shield, but by 1972, the very perfection of his life began to betray him. The suspicions did not yet have his name attached in ink and certainty, but the machinery of counterintelligence had stirred awake. Surveillance teams were tasked with following him discreetly. At first, it was little more than the occasional trailing car, the invisible hand that began tapping phone lines, the quiet collation of his habits. Guillaume began to feel it before he could prove it. Conversations at his flat carried a new tension. When the phone rang, there was a pause before the second click that made him wonder who else was listening. His commutes felt heavier, his steps sharpened by the knowledge that somewhere behind him, out of view, he was being measured, weighed, and perhaps already condemned. Paranoia seeped into the quiet moments, growing into something larger with every passing week. The tension was mirrored by the state of Brandt himself. The Chancellor, exhausted from a relentless cycle of domestic scandals, infighting within his Social Democratic Party, and the unyielding pressure of Cold War negotiations, leaned more heavily than ever on those closest to him. Among them, no one seemed steadier, no one seemed more loyal than Guillaume. Brandt would retreat into weary silences, eyes shadowed by fatigue, and then murmur, almost as confession, "You are one of the few I can trust." Those words, given in private, pierced Guillaume with a force greater than any order from East Berlin. It was trust made personal, no longer a matter of files or schedules, but of a man's aching need for someone who would not betray him. And it was precisely this intimacy, this tragic convergence of loyalty and deception, that deepened the knife of betrayal he carried silently in his chest. Evenings became the worst. Guillaume would walk home from the office, the streets of Bonn dim and damp, and sometimes he would hear that engine, a car idling just long enough behind him to unsettle his steps. Once he stopped suddenly, turning to confront the street, but the road lay empty, only shadows and silence meeting his gaze. Yet, as he resumed, he heard it again, the low growl of a vehicle keeping its distance. He wondered if it was a test, a warning, or merely imagination sharpened by guilt. The dread of discovery had begun to gnaw at his composure, and even the smallest irregularity felt like the tightening of a noose. He would return home, close the door quietly, and stand in the stillness of his flat, listening, waiting, unsure whether the walls themselves were now betraying him. For the B&D and the CIA, suspicion was not yet enough. What they needed was evidence, and so they continued to shadow him, to probe the edges of his carefully maintained life. Guillaume, meanwhile, had to act as though nothing had changed. Each morning he appeared in Brandt's office, collected papers, scheduled meetings, and offered quiet reassurances, even as his own nerves throbbed with the knowledge that eyes were watching from unseen corners. Each night he knew that he would have to continue his dangerous dance with the East. Dead drops in quiet parks, the delicate craft of turning stolen documents into micro-dot photographs smuggled through seemingly ordinary letters, and the staged chance encounters with handlers at restaurants where a handshake lasted a second too long and passed information that could topple governments. Every act now carried the weight of risk multiplied tenfold, because the web was tightening and he could feel it. Inside the Chancellor's circle, Brandt's troubles were mounting. A series of domestic political scandals had weakened his footing. Rivals within the SPD were circling like vultures, and the external pressure of NATO allies questioning his Ostpolitik drained what strength remained. In these moments, Guillaume was always there, pen in hand, loyal gaze steady, offering what appeared to be unshakable support. Brandt, perhaps too weary to question the perfection of this loyalty, clung to it as one clings to the last handhold in a storm. That bond, forged in exhaustion and misplaced trust, only sharpened the suspense of what was unfolding in the shadows. The counterintelligence teams pressed on, compiling fragments, testing threads. Files began to accumulate, each with details that pointed toward the possibility of a mole deep within the Chancellor's office. Guillaume's name, for now, was one among several. He had not yet been marked, not yet circled in the ink of certainty, but the lists were forming, the suspicions narrowing, and the unseen tide moving closer to his feet. The sound of a car in the night, the click of a tapped phone line, the sudden silence that followed when a colleague entered the room, each was no longer paranoia, but the first signs of a net drawing closed. And so, the stage tightened, the suspense stretched thin as a wire. Guillaume's dual life was now balanced on a knife edge, with Brandt's whispered trust in his ear and the cold gaze of intelligence services closing in from the dark. The question was no longer whether he could continue, but how long before the cracks in the facade split wide open, revealing the truth he had carried so carefully for so long. And then came the moment when the lists of potential moles, compiled quietly in the offices of intelligence, bore his name, written there, still unmarked, but waiting, ominous, for the stroke of a pen that would circle it and seal his fate. Imagine the sound of a knock at the door, sharp and deliberate, breaking the early morning stillness of a Bonn apartment on April 24th, 1974. It is not the careless knock of a neighbor, nor the polite tap of a postman with a letter to deliver, but something heavier, rehearsed, final. Inside, Crystal Guillaume freezes for an instant, a teacup trembling in her hand, as though her body already understands what her mind refuses to name. Günter sits across from her, the morning paper folded but unread, his expression still carrying the faint trace of a smile from an ordinary breakfast. The knock comes again, louder this time, 3 measured beats, each echoing like the end of a symphony long in the making. He does not look at the door immediately. Instead, his gaze lingers on Crystal, and for a fleeting moment there is something almost tender in his eyes, the calm recognition of a man who has always known the day would come. Then he stands, slowly, carefully, as though every movement must preserve the illusion of control. He does not run, does not panic, because in the life of a spy there is no dignified escape when the end arrives at your doorstep. Only the acceptance that the role has been played to its conclusion. When the door opens, the silence explodes into the stern voices of investigators, the shuffle of footsteps, the unmistakable authority of men who have not come to ask, but to take. Crystal gasps, the teacup slipping from her hand and shattering against the floor, porcelain fragments scattering across the kitchen tiles like broken pieces of their carefully constructed double life. One of the officers, his tone clipped and formal, announces the charge, suspicion of espionage on behalf of a foreign power. The words hang in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating, though no one in that apartment needs them explained. Guillaume listens, his face calm, almost resigned, the faintest nod of acknowledgement betraying neither guilt nor innocence, only the burden of inevitability. He places his hands out without protest, the cold steel of handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists with the metallic finality of a trap closing. In that single moment, decades of careful maneuver, of coded letters and whispered exchanges, of photographs hidden in innocuous packages, and secrets ferried across borders, collapse into nothing but silence. Outside, neighbors crane their necks to glimpse the quiet spectacle of an arrest that will soon ripple far beyond the walls of this modest home. Crystal, trembling but composed in her own way, follows behind, her face pale, her eyes wide with the terror of realization. The door closes behind them with a dull thud, as though sealing away forever the illusion of an ordinary family life. The news travels quickly through the corridors of Bonn, where whispers become murmurs, and murmurs turn into a storm. A man who had sat at the Chancellor's side, who had arranged his schedule and passed him confidential files, now revealed to be an agent of East Germany. It is a scandal not merely of politics, but of intimacy, because this was no distant official hidden away in some obscure office. This was a man whose proximity to power had been built on trust. Brandt hears the news not with the shock of sudden betrayal, but with the crushing weight of confirmation, for the suspicions whispered in intelligence circles have finally taken shape in the most brutal way possible. The Chancellor's circle has been pierced from within, and the man he considered a loyal aide has been unmasked as the instrument of his undoing. In the days that follow, Bonn becomes a city alive with paranoia. Journalists descend upon the story like vultures, each headline more sensational than the last, each rumor feeding the next. Who knew? Who should have known? How could the Chancellor, with all his experience and instinct, have allowed a Stasi agent into his closest confidences? Opposition politicians seize the moment, their voices sharp, their accusations laced with both genuine outrage and opportunistic glee. For them, it is not merely a scandal, it is a gift, a chance to wound a chancellor already weakened by internal divisions and external pressures. The very image of Brandt, once the symbol of renewal and bold diplomacy, now begins to crack under the relentless scrutiny of betrayal. Yet, for Brandt himself, the devastation is not only political, it is personal, profoundly personal. personal. In the quiet hours, when the public noise dies down, he is left alone with the image of Guillaume, the trusted aide who had accompanied him through crucial meetings, who had carried his briefcase, who had seemed to share his burdens. To discover that every gesture of loyalty concealed a hidden allegiance is a humiliation so intimate that it gnaws at the very core of his being. Friends recall how Brandt withdrew into silence, his depression deepening, his once vibrant energy fading into shadows. He had always been a man who bore the scars of exile, of struggle, of the long fight against tyranny, but this betrayal seemed different. This was not the open brutality of an enemy, but the quiet treachery of someone within arm's reach, someone whose smile he had trusted. Historians, years later, would argue that the Stasi never truly intended to topple Brandt, that Guillaume was never designed as the weapon that would bring down a chancellor. They would point out that East German intelligence valued Brandt's Ostpolitik, his policy of engagement, which had opened new doors and eased tensions between East and West. To destabilize him would have been to undermine their own gains. And yet, history does not always move with intent. It lurches with accidents, collides with vulnerabilities already present. Guillaume was the trigger, not the architect, the match that found dry tinder waiting to ignite. Brandt's government was already strained, his own struggles with depression already making him fragile, and in that context, the revelation of Guillaume's betrayal was less a calculated strike than the final blow to an edifice already weakened. The days between Guillaume's arrest and Brandt's final decision pass like a slow unraveling. Each morning brings new headlines, each evening new whispers of resignation. Inside the government, confidence erodes, ministers question whether the chancellor can survive, and allies abroad watch with unease as the leader of one of NATO's most important states falters under the weight of scandal. Guillaume, meanwhile, sits in his cell, calm, disciplined, carrying himself with the quiet bearing of a man who has long understood the risks of his profession. Interrogators press him for details, for networks, for names, but his answers remain careful, measured, revealing less than they seek. His loyalty to the mission remains intact, even as the walls close around him. Crystal, too, endures her own questioning, caught in the suffocating grip of a life suddenly stripped bare of its disguises. And then comes the inevitable, May 7th, 1974. Brandt, after days of agonized silence, makes the decision that history will forever remember him for. He resigns. The announcement falls like a thunderclap across Europe, a chancellor brought down not by a foreign army, nor by a crushing election defeat, but by the betrayal of a man within his own circle. It is a resignation not only of office, but of trust, an acknowledgement that the intimacy of power had been fatally compromised. For Brandt, the personal humiliation outweighs even the political cost, and his departure leaves behind a mixture of sorrow, anger, and disbelief. The image of Brandt walking away from the chancellery becomes an enduring symbol, a reminder that in the world of espionage, the sharpest wounds are inflicted not on battlefields, but in the quiet rooms where trust once seemed unshakable. Guillaume's arrest has done more than end a career. It has ended an era. Ostpolitik, the great experiment of dialogue across the Iron Curtain, now lies tainted by suspicion, and the chancellor who once embodied hope is remembered in part for the betrayal that undid him. But even in resignation, questions linger. Did the Stasi truly win by accident? Was Guillaume nothing more than a pawn caught in the larger storms of history, or was his placement in Brandt's circle a calculated act of precision? Did Brandt fall because of Guillaume, or did Guillaume merely provide the spark for a collapse already waiting to happen? These questions, unanswered, hover over the scene like ghosts, ensuring that the story of Guillaume and Brandt would never be resolved neatly, but forever bound in ambiguity. And as history shifts into its next chapter, the cliffhanger sharpens. A chancellor has fallen, a spy has been unmasked, and the Cold War has claimed yet another casualty, not through tanks or missiles, but through the quiet betrayal of trust. The stage is set for what follows, where the trial, the interrogations, and the reckoning of loyalties will expose the full cost of a life lived in deception. For on May 7th, 1974, as Brandt steps down in humiliation, the world sees not just the resignation of a leader, but the triumph of a secret that was never meant to be discovered, until it was. The courtroom doors opened with a groan of wood and iron, and for a brief moment all sound seemed to fall away. What entered was not just a man in handcuffs, but the ghost of a scandal that had shaken a nation to its core. Günter Guillaume, the quiet aide whose hands had once shuffled papers for the most powerful man in West Germany, now stepped forward as if rehearsing a role written long ago. His hair was thinner, his face marked by weeks in custody, but his walk was steady, deliberate, almost unnervingly calm. Journalists craned their necks, pens hovered, and the public gallery surged forward with a hunger for spectacle. For them, Guillaume was no longer merely a spy. He was the perfect infiltrator, the man who had slipped into the very heart of democracy and torn it apart from within, and now they demanded to see him judged. Yet as he sat down before the judges, he gave no sign of weakness, no glance of apology or fear. His silence was louder than any outburst could have been, and those watching soon realized that this trial would not just be about treason or politics, but about a battle of nerves, of composure, of who would break first. The prosecution wasted no time in painting Guillaume as the embodiment of betrayal. They laid out the story like a stage play, each scene punctuated by words that carried venom: infiltration, manipulation, destruction. They summoned witnesses who had once worked beside him, aides who recalled his diligence, his quiet presence in meetings, his careful notes at Brandt's side. Now, each of those memories was recast as evidence of his treachery, the meticulousness of a man serving not Bonn, but Berlin. Guillaume listened without flinching. If he felt any shame, it was hidden deep beneath a mask honed over decades of double life. His lawyers spoke little, knowing the trial was not so much about defense as about ritual. West Germany needed this spectacle, needed to show itself and the world that it could not be undone by silence, that it would expose the enemy even if the Chancellor himself had already fallen. Yet, it was the questions that followed which revealed the strange, unnerving aura Guillaume carried into the courtroom. Investigators pressed him for names, for details of handlers, for networks that could be traced across the invisible frontier dividing Germany. He offered none. Each time they leaned in with another demand: who recruited you? Who received your reports? Who gave the order that brought down Brandt? He met them with the same quiet defiance, the kind of silence that feels heavier than shouting. Occasionally he allowed himself a faint smile, as if amused at the theater unfolding around him, as if aware that his value lay precisely in what he did not say. The West wanted catharsis, but Guillaume denied them even that. Behind the show of justice, there was fear. If Guillaume spoke too much, he could shatter fragile secrets on both sides of the border. If he said too little, the West could only guess at how far the Stasi's reach had extended, how many others might be sitting unnoticed in the offices of government. His silence became its own kind of message. That loyalty to the cause, to the hidden world he served, mattered more than personal survival. Those watching began to sense it too, and the courtroom developed a strange tension, as though the accused man were the one in control, as though the state itself had become the interrogated party. When the verdict came in, it was no surprise. Guillaume was found guilty of high treason and sentenced to 13 years in prison. The judge's words fell with the weight of finality, yet Guillaume betrayed no reaction. He simply rose, nodded faintly, and allowed himself to be led away. For the press, it was the climax they had come to record. For the public, it was a promise that justice had been served. But for the intelligence services on both sides of the divide, it was only another act in a longer play. The spy who had destroyed a chancellor was not finished, and his silence meant he remained dangerous. Prison did not break him. Years passed in the rhythm of confinement, but Guillaume endured with the same composure that had carried him through the trial. Guards remarked on his calm, his ability to wait, his refusal to complain. Yet, beyond the prison walls, the life he had built was crumbling. Crystal, the wife who had once shared in the duplicity of his mission, found the weight unbearable. Letters carried her disillusion across the bars, resentment that their lives had been sacrificed for a cause she no longer believed in, anger at the years stolen by secrecy, loneliness that gnawed deeper than loyalty. Eventually she filed for divorce, severing the bond that had once made their double life bearable. For Guillaume, it was a cut deeper than any sentence the court could hand down. His son bore an even heavier burden. Children at school whispered about him, taunted him with the shame of being the child of a traitor. Teachers looked away uneasily, neighbors muttered, friends distanced themselves. To grow up under the shadow of a father branded as the enemy within was to carry a weight one had never chosen, and the boy struggled to find a self not defined by betrayal. Guillaume could offer no comfort from his cell. His silence protected a state, but it left his family fractured beyond repair. By the late 1970s, the Cold War's rhythms had shifted. Détente had cooled, then faltered, and the invisible war of intelligence resumed with new intensity. West German officials debated what to do with Guillaume, whether to let him rot in prison as a warning or to use him as a bargaining chip. In the corridors of power, pragmatism won. A spy so valuable, so symbolic, could be traded. In East Berlin, the Stasi calculated his worth with equal care. They had used him once as a ghost inside the West, and now his silence had preserved secrets worth more than gold. He was too precious to be left behind enemy lines. The negotiations were conducted in shadows, through intermediaries, across the gray zones where East and West touched without acknowledging it. Names were written on lists, lives measured in equivalence, freedom weighed against secrecy. And so, in 1981, after 7 years in prison, Guillaume was led once more into the cold air of a divided Germany. At Glienicke Bridge, the place where East and West exchanged their unwanted ghosts, he was brought forward. Across the span, another prisoner walked from the opposite direction. Neither man looked back. Guillaume's steps were slow, deliberate, his expression composed. As he crossed the midpoint, as his foot left Western soil and touched the threshold of the East, a faint smile flickered across his face. It was the smile of a man returning not home, but to the only identity that had ever truly defined him. The East welcomed him with banners, speeches, and proclamations. State media hailed him as a hero, the man who had humbled the West, who had brought down a chancellor, who had proven the superiority of socialist vigilance. Portraits were painted, stories were printed, and Guillaume's name was paraded as a symbol of triumph. But behind the applause, within the shadowed corridors of the Stasi, unease grew. They knew the truth of espionage, that a man who had lived so long between masks could never truly be trusted again. His silence had been unbroken in prison, but now he was free, and freedom brought unpredictability. To the world he was a celebrated hero. To the very state he had served, he was a loose end that could one day unravel the threads of secrecy. As the years between trial and freedom blurred into memory, Guillaume himself seemed caught between roles. He had been the quiet aide, the perfect infiltrator, the silent prisoner, the triumphant returnee. Now, in East Berlin, he was left with the hollow recognition that heroes of espionage are celebrated in public, but watched in private. Crystal was gone, his marriage dissolved. His son still carried the scars of a life shaped by betrayal. For all the parades and slogans, Guillaume walked with the air of a man who knew he remained on trial, not before judges, but before history itself. The Cold War had claimed him as one of its most haunting figures, a ghost who had slipped into the heart of power and walked back out again. But the question whispered even in the halls of those who had once controlled him was unsettling. What do you do with a ghost once its haunting is complete? Guillaume's life was no longer his own, and the Stasi's whispers hinted at fears they could never admit aloud. A man like him could never be fully trusted, and in a world where loyalty was currency, suspicion could be a death sentence. The story hung unfinished, suspended between triumph and threat as the years moved forward into a darker chapter. Guillaume had crossed back into East Germany with a smile, but whether it was the smile of victory or the smile of a man walking into another kind of trap, no one could yet tell. And so his return left a question lingering in the air, a question that neither East nor West dared answer fully. In the twilight of his career, the spy once hailed as a perfect infiltrator had become something more unsettling, a perfect uncertainty. It begins with a silence more crushing than applause, the kind of silence that follows a man who once walked into history as the embodiment of East Germany's greatest espionage triumph, and then found himself swallowed by the grayness of the very country he had risked everything for. Günter Guillaume stepped back across the Glienicke Bridge in 1981, exchanged like a pawn, a ghost traded in the twilight of the Cold War, and for a brief moment East Berlin roared with the orchestrated celebration of his return. The newspapers called him the hero spy, the man who had toppled a chancellor, the living proof that socialism could outwit the West at its highest level. But when the cameras stopped clicking and the officials moved on, Guillaume was left in a city that had no true place for him. The system he had devoted his life to treated him not as a man, but as a story. And stories could be used, paraded, then shelved. What is a spy without a mission, without shadows to move through? For Guillaume, the applause faded quickly into the quiet isolation of a life that felt smaller with every passing day. His flat in East Berlin was modest, its walls bare of any recognition of the upheaval he had caused in West Germany. Once, he had whispered in the ear of Willy Brandt, nudging himself closer to the machinery of power with every smile, every subtle suggestion. Now he walked alone through streets lined with gray facades and stood in queues like any other citizen of the Socialist Republic. Occasionally, the Stasi would summon him for appearances. A lecture at a party school, a carefully staged interview for domestic propaganda, a nod to remind the East German people that vigilance had its rewards. In those moments, Guillaume would sit in front of young party members, telling them about loyalty, about patience, about the importance of trust in the cause. His voice carried the practiced authority of someone who had played his role to perfection. Yet, when he returned home, the applause of the students evaporated into silence once more. He was not shaping history anymore. He was its leftover. Crystal had left him, unable to reconcile the decades of deception that had consumed their marriage, and their son Peter struggled under the weight of a name now synonymous with betrayal in the West and symbolic utility in the East. Guillaume, stripped of his closest bonds, was left only with the company of memory. Sometimes, in the quiet of the night, he replayed the old scenes in his head, the secret meetings in shadowed streets of Bonn, the sound of typewriters in the chancellery offices, the way Brandt would lean over documents, trusting him completely. He could still feel the paper under his hands, still recall the electric thrill of knowing that everything he touched was destined for another set of eyes in East Berlin. That was his purpose, and without it, he was a man without form. But the world around him was shifting in ways he could barely comprehend. The 1980s crept forward, bringing economic stagnation, dissent that the regime could no longer suppress, whispers of reform carried across the Iron Curtain. Guillaume, still paraded occasionally for propaganda, began to notice how the applause felt thinner, how the faces in the audience looked less convinced. Even within the halls of the Stasi, his story was treated as an artifact rather than a weapon. Some officers who had once revered his work now saw him as a loose thread, a relic of an operation too famous to ignore, yet too dangerous to keep alive in memory. His silence had protected them all during the trial in the West, but the same silence now unnerved his handlers in the East. What if he spoke too freely in private? What if bitterness crept into his words? For a man who had once been an asset, there was always the risk of becoming a liability. And then came the thunder of 1989, a sound that reverberated through every street of East Berlin and every shadowed corner of the Stasi's labyrinth. Guillaume stood in his apartment listening to the news of protests swelling in Leipzig, of crowds chanting for freedom, of people refusing to step back. The Berlin Wall, that immovable symbol of division, began to tremble. For Guillaume, it was like watching the ground fall away beneath him. He had devoted his entire life to the cause of East Germany, to the idea that socialism would triumph, that his sacrifice would be written in the annals of victory. But now he saw the faces on the television, the joyous disbelief of men and women climbing the wall, tearing at its concrete, stepping into a new world. As the wall crumbled, so too did the foundation of his own life's meaning. In interviews later, Guillaume tried to maintain composure. He insisted he had done his duty, that he had no regrets, that he had served his country to the end. Yet the strain was visible in his words, the tension of a man who realized that the state he had given everything to was vanishing before his eyes. Former colleagues in the West gave interviews of their own, painting him as the perfect infiltrator, the smiling Judas who had brought down a chancellor. In the West, he was remembered as a villain, in the East as a poster child for a country that no longer existed. And in between those two competing myths stood the man himself, aging, alone, and bitter. The loneliness of his later years was the cruelest punishment of all. He walked the streets of reunified Berlin as a ghost, unrecognized by most, shunned by those who did remember. There was no country left to claim him, no ideology left to anchor him. His flat grew quieter with each year, the silence broken only by the occasional interviewer who sought his perspective, hungry to reopen the wounds of history. When he spoke, his words carried the stubborn pride of a man who refused to see himself as a traitor. He insisted that history had already judged him, that he had played his part, that what remained was not for him to change. Yet, behind that defiance was the unmistakable weariness of someone who knew that the world had moved on without him. By the early 1990s, the Stasi itself was gone, dissolved in the collapse of the East. Files were opened, secrets spilled into the light, names and operations dissected by journalists and scholars. Guillaume's name appeared in those files, a reminder of one of the most devastating breaches in West German history. He was still the perfect infiltrator on paper, but in reality, he was a man sitting alone in his small apartment, nursing the memory of a mission that had destroyed a chancellor and defined his life, but could not give him peace. When death came for him in 1995, it was not dramatic. No conspiracies, no sudden revelations, just the quiet passing of a man who had once carried the weight of nations in the briefcase by his side. He left the world still convinced he had made history, still convinced that his actions had meaning. But history itself judged him differently. To some, he was the traitor who betrayed trust at the highest level. To others, he was a loyal son of East Germany, a man who never broke, never named his handlers, never renounced the cause. And to many more, especially in the decades that followed, he became simply a shadow, a reminder of a divided world that no longer exists, of the thin line between loyalty and betrayal, and of how even the most famous spies can die forgotten. Yet there is a chilling irony in his story that lingers long after the man himself is gone. Guillaume toppled a chancellor, altered the course of West German politics, and proved the power of espionage at its most devastating. But in the end, the state he had served with such devotion collapsed, and the chancellor he had betrayed was later remembered with far greater honor than the spy who brought him down. The man who once seemed larger than life became, in his final years, smaller than the myths that had consumed him. And that is perhaps the cruelest fate of all for a spy who lived for shadows, to end as a ghost not feared, not celebrated, but quietly forgotten. The knock came again in the mind's eye, echoing across decades as if it had never left that quiet street in Bonn on April 24th, 1974. The memory was vivid, relentless. The shiver of anticipation, the soft rustle of curtains as unmarked cars pulled to a stop, the almost imperceptible tension in the air before the world tilted. Guillaume had opened the door, smiling, calm, unafraid of the chaos that would follow, And in that moment, he was no longer just a man. He was a hinge on which history would turn. The arrest was quick, precise, almost clinical, and yet the reverberations were monumental, shaking not only the West German government, but the fragile sense of trust that binds every political structure. And as the years pressed on, as trials concluded and exchanges were made, as families fractured and ideologies crumbled, one truth remained. The most dangerous spies were rarely the ones skulking in alleys or whispering behind walls. They were the ones who moved in plain sight, the ones who earned trust so completely that it became a shield, a disguise more effective than any forged passport or coded message. They were ordinary men and women by day, shaping policy, filing papers, offering counsel, sharing a smile. But beneath that veneer, beneath the routine and the mundane, they carried secrets powerful enough to topple leaders, to reshape nations, to rewrite the course of history without anyone ever suspecting. In the quiet that followed Guillaume's life, in the empty apartments and the quiet streets of a reunified Germany, the question lingered like smoke. If one man, unnoticed, had the patience, the cunning, and the opportunity to bring down a chancellor, who else might be standing close to power today, moving in the light, unseen, waiting for the precise moment to act? The thought was a shadow stretching across decades, a reminder that vigilance is never complete, that trust can be a weapon, and that history, as it turns, is always vulnerable to those willing to wait in silence, smiling. Guillaume's story ended with his death in 1995, unremarkable to the world but monumental in the lessons it left behind. The chancellor he had betrayed was remembered with respect. The West German government endured. Yet, the echo of one man's quiet treachery continued to hum beneath the surface of political life. The knock on the door, the smile of the spy, the calm acceptance of fate, these were the images that persisted. And in those images, in the story of a man who lived as both loyal citizen and clandestine agent, the ultimate truth remained. The greatest betrayal is often not shouted from the rooftops, but delivered with a quiet nod, a trusted hand, a presence so unremarkable that no one ever suspects the danger lurking within. So the question remains, even now, as the world moves forward and power shifts in ways both visible and hidden. Who walks among the powerful today, cloaked in trust, patient, observing and smiling, ready to tip the scales with the same quiet certainty that brought down a chancellor decades ago? History remembers the outcomes, but it rarely reveals the invisible hands that shape them. And that is the final, enduring lesson of Günter Guillaume, that the shadows of betrayal are sometimes cast not in darkness, but in the brightest light of trust itself.